right. So they say the church didn't start till after Pentecost.
Right.
So then they'll go to the woman caught in the very act of adultery, and they'll say, Jesus changed the law.
That's right.
Now, wait a minute. You just said that the church age doesn't start until after Pentecost. You can't have it both ways. You can't say Jesus changed the law with a woman caught in adultery, say that's Jesus' New Testament ethic. This is what Schofield did on the Sermon on the Mount, said that's New Testament ethic. And then go and say that stoning of rebellious children, that's an Old Testament law that doesn't apply.
So you got to take
all of the principles, they all apply. We just don't know how they often apply.
But how can we use them if we don't know how they apply?
Well, I think because back to Hebrews again, the writer of Hebrews chapter 5.
Who was that, by the way?
I don't know. Most people say it was.
Gotcha. Something you don't know. I knew I'd get him.
Cameraman's not supposed to be laughing.
Shut down. I won. All right. 1-0.
The writer of the Hebrews stops in mid-thought. He wants to deal with Melchizedek, and he stops. He says, I can't go on and talk about Melchizedek because you have been slow of hearing. He says, by this time you should be teachers, but now you need somebody to reteach you the fundamental principles of God's Word. And then he goes on and he says that the only way that you can really excel as a Christian is through practice. Is you just don't read it, but you practice it. You practice by studying how this particular law applies here. How would you think this out? How does Jesus use it? How does Paul apply it? Paul takes the Old Testament law regarding animal husbandry. You know, you don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the corn.
Right.
Okay, you let him feed. He's working. Well, you would say, well, that only applies to animals. It doesn't. Paul applies it to people who work in the church.
Right.
So
okay, most people on the dispensational side, that is a true application of how an Old Testament verse applies. If it's not repeated in the New Testament, or the application is
where do they get that? It's because it's not repeated in the New Testament. Give me a verse that says if a law isn't repeated in the New Testament, it's no longer valid. Then you've got to say...
Well, because Jesus fulfilled the law. So in his fulfilling the law, he is telling us how the law actually applies. You've heard it said.
But look, if you say Jesus fulfilled the law and the law passes the way, then you're saying that he only fulfilled some of it because some of it are still applicable in the New Testament. Paul takes an obscure law regarding animals and he applies it to people who work in the church. Right. And now we're going to say he picks that law out of the whole Old Testament, and the rest of them surrounding that law don't apply in some way or another. I never understood where that principle comes from. If it's not repeated in the New Testament, it isn't applicable. I remember sitting down with some dispensationalists up in Washington, D.C. when they used that same type of argument. David Chilton, who's since died, said, well, then would you say that if a pastor were caught having sex with an animal, because it isn't prohibited in the New Testament, that you couldn't discipline him? And this professor from Dallas Theological Seminary, and if I said his name, people would know who it was, said, right, since it wasn't repeated in the New Testament, it's not applicable in the New Testament. The chairs from the other professors were screeching across the floor in order to get away from what this guy was saying. And one of the other guys said, no, it follows under the prohibition regarding fornication.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Then here's the question I asked him. I said, how do you know what prohibitions are included under fornication? A big smile went over his face because he knew what the answer was. You got to go back to the Old Testament. You got to figure out what are the prohibitions regarding fornication. So defining fornication, he said you had to go back to the Old Testament to do it. Read all the commentators, even the dispensational commentators. That's what they'll do. Fornication is defined by the Old Testament.
Sure, we understand how to define it. We got that. But you're trying to say that we should be applying the punishment for those who break it?
Jesus applied the punishment regarding rebellious children. He applied it to those Pharisees, but it obviously did not mean taking them out and stoning them to death.
But he didn't apply it to the woman who was caught in adultery.
Oh, he did.
Well, he didn't stone her.
What was the charge?
She was caught in adultery.
That's not what the charge. She was caught in the very act of adultery. How many people does it take to commit adultery?
2.
Where was the man?
He had a horse and he got away.
Okay.
So you're going back to the law again and saying that
Jesus followed the law exactly. Caught in the very act. Should bring a charge against her. Jesus says, Jesus writes, you know, in the
Do you
down
know
in the
what he wrote, by
ground.
the way?
We don't know. So I said, we
Number
don't know.
two.
I didn't say I didn't know. I said, we don't know. So Jesus says to these men, okay, bring your charge against her. And nobody could. No witnesses came up against her. Nobody would testify to this because they got trapped. They set the whole thing up. How do you catch somebody in the act of adultery?
Right.
Unless you walk in on them accidentally, but there were too many of them for that. They set her up.